This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Welcome to Asher and Torah Anytime. We are up to Perek Daled. Vayhi Melech Shlomo Melech al Kol Yisrael. And the King Solomon was king over all of Israel. And you know, whenever you like in the Torah, there's certain parts in the Torah that have all these Gewalt stories and messages. Then sometimes you learn halachas that you also feel it has like a practical application. You know, it's the halachas. Torah is Melachim Hira. It has to actually tell you what to do. And then there's the part in the Torah where you go through all the names. You go through all the names, and you should know that that's also part of the Torah. All the names, and when we tell you who does what and what does when, it's also part of the Hira that you have to have a structure and a system of how to do things. So I think that's the secret message of Perek Daled. These are the Sarim, the ministers. Azaryahu ben Tzadok. Azaryahu, the son of Tzadok, which Tzadok, we said, was the Kohen who took over Rav Yasar. Azaryahu ben Tzadok HaKohen. So it looks like his son took his place. Elichorev va'achia b'nei Shisha. So you have Elichorev va'achia, the son of Shisha. Soifrem, they're the scribes. Yehoshaphat ben Achilud. Yehoshaphat ben Achilud, he's the maskir. He's like the secretary. He makes the Seder Hayom. He makes the schedule. The chief of staff. Of Noyo ben Yehoiada, him we know already who he was. He's the general. Alatzava, he's in charge of the army. V'tzadok v'Avyasar HaKohanim. Tzadok and Avyasar are the Kohanim. Now, the interesting thing over here is that even though Avyasar was just sent away when Shlomo Melech cleaned house, and he sent Avyasar to live in the Ir HaKohanim, well, here you see that he didn't totally. He had a karetz atoy for Avyasar, that he felt along with his father, and he was loyal to him, and he stood there with the Torah. And so here it says that Avyasar, even though he was sent to live in the Ir HaKohanim, he still had a position that he was the sgan or something. And that it means he wasn't a Kohen Gadol, but he was still in a high position. Azaryahu ben Nason ala nitzavim. Azaryahu ben Nason, he's in charge of the domains, which we're going to see. He set up a taxation system, very interesting. The Zovad ben Nason, Kohen, Zovad ben Nason, and this is a very interesting one. I found this one fascinating. The Zovad ben Nason, Kohen, right? He's Rei HaMelech. What does Rei HaMelech mean? He's a friend of the king. What does that mean? It means that part of the cabinet of the high court was that they had somebody that his position was to be friend of the king. Because the king also needs a friend. Even though the king is all the way up there, and the king is but the king also needs a friend. So they had somebody who was Mamuna to be his friend. It was like a little good sheller. And he was there that the king should be able to talk to him, and he should be able to verbring with him, he should be able to laugh to him, and he should be able to let down his guard, and he should be able to be Shlomo Achi. Even though you're Shlomo Melech, you still, somebody has to be able to get a clap off and pleitze and tell you Shlomo Achi. If you remember back in the story, David Melech also had a friend who was loyal to him, who brought down, who went to Achitophel, who went into the house of Achitophel. Anyway, V'achishor ala boes. V'achishor ala boes. I'm just thinking that instead of thinking that that Shlomo Melech had a friend, they have to go into the world of Zovad ben Nason. What type of a person was the Zovad ben Nason Kohen that he was capable of being the friend of the king? That means the person has to strive that how can I be the friend of? To have a friend, you need to be a friend. You got to learn how to be a friend. Achishar, and Achishar is ala boes. He's in charge of the house, of the palace, we'll call it. He had to make sure that all the expenses and accounts payable, accounts receivable, everything is running. He is a tax collection. Now we said before that there was nitzavim, there was 12 reps. That the way how he set up his taxation system is that here, do a signs. The way that he set up his taxation system is that he made domains, and he set up a rep on the domain, and he was kilkulu as hamelach ve'ez beisoy. He B'shlem shnei mas nitzal al kol Yisrael kilkulu as hamelach ve'ez beisoy how chodesh b'shana yeh ala echad the chalkel. What he did was that he took his entire domain, he split it up into 12 territories, and he put in a tzig, he put a rep on that domain. So the taxes from this section funded this month, Cheshvan was covered by this rep from this domain, from the taxes that came in from his domain. And that's how he set himself up. That was a stream of income, a dedicated stream of income for each month of running the palace. These are the names of these reps. Ben Chur, he's Bahar Ephraim. Ben Deker, he is B'Mokatz. U'B'Shalvim, U'B'Shomesh, Ve'elon, B'Schonon. Ben Chesed, he's Ba'arubos. And he was in charge of Soicha V'Chol Eretz Chefer. Ben Avinadav, he is responsible al Kol Nofas Doyar, and the entire beach area, like the Chof Hayam. Tofaz Bashloimo Hoyslo Liisha. Later he became an Edom. He became a son-in-law of Shlomo Melech. Bano ben Achilud, he is in charge of Tanakh Umegidoy v'chol beishan asher eitzel tzorsano mitachas leYisrael v'beishan ad ovel mechoyle ad me'ever leyokmaam. Ben Gever is Beramos Gilad. He also runs Chavos Yoir ben Menashe asher begilad loy Chevel Argoy v'asher babashon. He was in charge of that area. Shishem Orim Gedolos Choyma Ovriach Nechoshes. Achinadav ben Idoy Machanoimo, he's in charge of the south side. Achimaat, he's ben Naphtali, he's in the region of Shevet Naphtali. Gamho, he was also an Edom, son-in-law. So 2 out of these 12 became son-in-laws by Shlomo Melech. Lokach es basmas b'Shlomo le'isha. Ba'ano ben Chushi, he was ba'asher be'olos, Yeshavet ben Peruach be'Yisachar, Shimi ben Elo ben Yaman, Gever ben Uri be'Eretz Gilad, Eretz Sichon Melech Amori ve'Og Melech HaBashan, V'Netziv Echad, and there was one rep, Asher ba'Aretz. Yehuda v'Yisrael Rabim Kachol Asher Hayom L'Rov Oichel B'Shoyis M'Smeichem. So, because this was a time when there was no battles, life was good for the Jewish people. There was a system where the taxes came in, and we're going to see in the next Perek, this is the end of Perek Dal, we're going to see in the next Perek, where the phrase Suda Shloime B'Shat comes from, what it meant to have a feast. Just Agav, I just find it, I remember once, I was talking to a guy, there's in the 12-step programs, and all the 12-step programs, there's a book called The Big Book, which is basically describing the 12-step program. And I was once talking to a guy of how the system works. So they read the book. You go through the chat, you read the book, and they read the book again and again and again. And he told me that a big portion of this book, or I don't know, a big chunk of the book, is about how you run the organization. The details of running the organization. It's like how you take care of the finances. I don't know exactly all the structures and system of running this organization, which is obviously an organization that's running already for many, many years. And when they read the book, you also read those parts of the book, which is extremely technical, and who runs what and how you run what. Because in order to get to the juice, In order to get to the neshama, you have to have the kelim. So whenever you read a Navi, all of these pirakim, which is the numbers of this and the cheshbon of that, and you say, oh, okay, let's just skip that part. It's like, and you say, no. This is where the devil, the devil's in the details. This is where the success is at. If you can break it down into the details and figure out the infrastructure and the system and remember the names of the people who actually served you, the people who schwitzed their whole life to collect the taxes, which is b'chlal not such a geschmack job, and the guy who was the chief of staff, also not such a geschmack job, and the guy who was a rep, who took care of the area of you, we don't talk about him in the whole Navi. He just mentioned in one pasuk one time. But he's still mentioned in the Navi. You know why? Because without him, there wouldn't be anything happening. Just a moedik limit. Okay, so let's go on to Perek Hey. So Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, is the king from Nahar Peras until Eretz Pelishtim, Ad Gvul Mitzrayim, till the borders of Egypt. Magishim Mincha v'oivdim Shlomo kol yemei chayav. Whoever lived in that area, where a servant came in one way or the other, v'hilechem Shlomo l'yom echad. You know what the feast? You know how much bread went into the palace of Solomon? Shloishim koir, 30 koir. Now, I don't know exactly the amounts, and I don't know exactly these numbers. I never know if these numbers are literal or they're not literal or they're figurative and it just means a huge amount. But whatever it is, when we talk about Suda Shlomo B'Shata, here's where it's from. Soilas v'shishim koir komach. Can you give me the English translation for this? For just, half of these words. Asara Bokar B'riyem. Okay. Sarah Bakar Briyam. So Solomon's provisions for one day was 30 cart of fine flour, 60 cart of flour, 10 fattened oxen, Esrim Bakar Re'i, and 20 oxen from the pasture. So there was fattened oxen, and then there was pastured oxen. I guess that had a different taste. It's like the difference between American oxen. They feed it corn. When you get them from Argentina, they're grass-fed. That's why in Eretz Yisrael you should always, if you have a choice between beef and chicken, choose the chicken. Besides for the gazelle, deer, yachmur, and fattened fowl. So I'm not sure what yachmur is. Levad me'ayol letzvi vayachmur ubarburim, like barburim uslavadagim, that's to get fattened fowl, avusim, geese, kihu, barburim, avusem. So these were like delicacies. It wasn't just enough food to fill you. This was like next level delicacies. Kihu roide b'chol eved hanahar. He ruled for the whole eved hanahar mi tifsach, which is al nar peraz v'ad azar b'chol malka eved hanahar v'sholem hoyolem mikol avodav misav, and there was peace. Part of the strategy, everybody wonders, why did Shlomo HaMelech have to make such grand feasts? It was the same strategy that Achashverosh tried to do when he made this huge feast. The point of making a feast wasn't, the smallest part of making a feast in the ancient world was having a good time. That's like the smallest part of the game. The big story was that's how you showed power, control, and you explained to your rivals around the corner that it's not worth messing with you. When you were a show off and you said, hey, then everybody knew you don't mess. So that's basically when you're running an operation that you have a guzma of a feast going on every single day, then everybody knows, hey, I'm not going to mess with the big boys. וישב יהודה וישראל לבטח, איש תחס גפנו ותחס לנוסם מדון ובשווה כל ימי שלמה. ויהיו לשלמה 40,000 אורבוי סוסים למרכבוי. He has 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots. Stables. Urvoi Susim. Rather, when you go to the Koisel, by the way, like under Harabais, I just discovered this recently, that when they built the Harabais was built like as a retaining wall, and there's basically what's Harabais? It's a retaining wall. It's the biggest retaining wall project ever done until the modern day, until today. It's a huge, humongous area, I don't know, like 40 acres or something. Humongous area of a retaining wall. Now, how did they make this retaining wall? So there was a mountain, and they had to raise up the whole thing. So, how did they raise them? So the Mishnah says they built kippim. They made arches. And then on top of the arches, they filled it up, because they didn't have tractors to bring dirt. You know how much dirt you would have to bring to fill up a retaining wall? So they built kippim. They built these arches, and on top of that, they built a stone platform, and that's the stone platform. Now, if Harabais is still standing today, then those kippim obviously have to still be around today. So, I always wondered, like, what's underneath the Harabais? And finally, I asked the tour guide, and I asked the second tour guide, and yeah, it's there today. There's this huge area underneath the Harabais, humongous place where you can fit in tens of thousands of people. Imagine the whole Harabais just underneath it. And in 1999, the Arabs excavated it, and it was a whole scandal that they dug down and they dumped all of these archaeological digs in the Kidron Valley. And you can fit in there literally like, I don't know, between 50 and 100,000 people, and they turned it into a mosque. So if you Google it, it's called, I finally figured out the name, it's called Ivrois Shloimo, Solomon's Stables. That's why I'm just saying it, because I remember Solomon's Stables. Not because Solomon kept his horses in these stables, but at least that's the name that it was given, Ivrois Shloimo, Solomon's Stables. It looks like Rosa Stables. Google it, and you'll see Ivrois Shloimo, and you'll see underneath the thing, there's a humongous place that you can put in, I don't know how many rows and rows of arches, ancient arches from 2,000 years ago, that only Muslims are allowed to go to, and the entrances are from like the other side, like the Mizrach side or wherever, and it's around today, and nobody, you ever know about it? You ever know? These are just things that are, we don't even know. Anyway, that's called Ivrois Shloimo. It's called Ivrois Shloimo because of the Ivrei Susim Lemerkefta, because of the thing. But obviously it didn't exist in the times of Shlomo Melech, because in the times of Shlomo Melech there wasn't a herd that didn't build that platform yet. Shnayim Aser Elef Pirashim, and he had 12,000 horsemen. Vilkilkelu Hanitzav Ma'elas HaMelech Shlomo V'eskol HaKerev El Shulchan HaMelech Shlomo. So these commissioners that we said, these 12 reps, they sustained Shlomo Melech every single month. Lo Yadru, nothing was missing. Lo Yadru Davar, nothing was missing. V'asa'oiden v'ateven, lasusim v'larechesh. The barley and the straw for the horses. Yoviyu elamoka masha yusham. It was brought to Solomon's stables. Ishki mishpatoy. Vayiten hamelech chachma. Vayiten hamelech chachma l'shloimo. Uzvuna harbe me'oid. He gave him a lot of wisdom, and a bright heart, an expansive heart, like the sand which is on the seashore. He was wiser than all of the men, all of the wisdom from the universe, from the world. And he was wiser than all men. He was wiser than all men, than these people who were wise men. All the nations around knew of the great wisdom of King Solomon. He spoke 3,000 Meshalim, and his songs were 1,005. Now, I don't know what the idea of Yushira Chamisha V'Olav, but in Shlosh Alaf Mashal, that he had 3,000 parables, that in Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe always talks about, in some very deep concept, that whenever you think of Shlosh Mashal, it means like, he had 3,000 Mashalim to explain one thing. That's the literal way you would understand it. But and the next level is that sometimes in order to bring down a concept, you have to find a mashal. There's a nimshal. The nimshal is what you can't understand. The mashal is what gives you a visualization of how you can grasp it. Like gloves. It gives you Michelle. It gives you some way to grab it. But then once you understand that mashal, there's another mashal that goes beneath it that turns the first mashal into a nimshal. So it's like a mashal, nimshal. Sometimes the concept is so esoteric and so far out that I give you a mashal, and then that mashal, once you grasp it, becomes the nimshal for a new mashal. And Shlomo HaMelech at Shloishes Alav mashal means he was able to take far out esoteric concepts and bring it down in layers and levels until it gets down to the lowest, to the lowest mind, to the lowest level of comprehension. That's Shloishes Alav mashal. So basically everything in the Bria is a mashal, nimshal. I can give you a mashal, nimshal on this, but it's just, we're not going to make the end of the shir. Vaydaber ala eitzim in ha'erez asher v'alvonon v'ad ha'ezev asher yotze bakir. He spoke of the trees from the cedar asher v'alvonon v'ad ha'ezev asher yotze bakir vaydaber ala be'ema v'ala oiv v'ala remesh v'ala dogim. This is where we get these ideas from, that he was able to communicate with the animals, he was able to communicate with the wildlife, which basically means that he learned, that he, on a simple level, I'm not going on a deep level, that this Lahavdil people today also understand the languages of all animals, and these people, especially the Native Americans, they for sure had the language that they knew every single call from an animal. They understood what the animal is trying to communicate. We just have this idea in our head that somehow animals communicate like humans do, and he was able to decipher their words, and he was able to understand just like humans do. But animals don't have consciousness like we do, but they do have a way of communicating, and he was able to understand that. It really means he was very perceptive. It really means that he was able to perceive all the nuances and the details and interpret it. And everybody came around to hear the wisdom from Shlomo and what he taught. So now Shlomo HaMelech, if you remember, one of his things was he was going to build a Beis HaMikdash. Because David HaMelech wanted to build the Beis HaMikdash, but David HaMelech couldn't build the Beis HaMikdash because Hashem said that it's not for you, it's for your future generations, or because later he told him because you have blood on your hands. So now, Vayishlach Hiram Kol Oyev, Ki Oyev Hoy Hiram LeDavid Kol Hayom. Vayishlach Hiram Melech Tzuras Avodah Shlomo, Ki Shama Ki Yosef Mashchul Melech Tachs Aviyu, Ki Oyev Hoy Hiram LeDavid Kol Hayom. So Hiram is the king of Tyre, and he was a friend of David HaMelech. Vayishlach Shlomo Hiram Leimoy, Ati Datas David Avi, Ki Lo Yuchel Livnei Bayis L'Shem Hashem Elikov. You know that David wasn't able to build the house of Hashem because of the war that's around it. Until Hashem subdued the enemies under the soles of his feet. And now I have peace. Nobody's bothering me. There's nothing. There's no adversary. There's no misfortune. I want to build a house for Hashem. Just like God promised, so now they're going to do business. Now they're going to set up to build the most beautiful edifice that ever was in the world. King Solomon was the greatest wisdom in the world. And he's the son who, he's sitting on the menucha, but Amnachon is going to build a beautiful house for God. And here is the plans or the details of what went into constructing, the amount of labor that went in. Cut down for me cedars from Lebanon. I'm going to pay whatever you're going to say the price is. I'm not gonna haggle with you. So here he's like schmieding him. He says, we don't have as good wood cutters, like the tzidonim. Now today we don't understand what's the big deal of cutting down wood. What's the big deal? You just take a You take a chainsaw and you cut it down and you put it through a mill. But if you'll ever ask the Google Adar how wood was cut in the ancient world, oh my gosh, was this a big deal to cut down wood? Well, it took
4 lives.
4 lives, yeah. It was a big deal how you cut down wood. There wasn't the saws, like to make a saw and to cut it, and then to make it into planks, and then to level those planks. It was a long, big Torah. It was something that you spent your life learning how to cut a plank of wood. You have to understand, it wasn't, in the ancient world, there's no plywood either. For sure not, right? Plywood is basically when you go around the tree and you cut it into thin strips, and then they go back and forth, so you create extremely large areas of a seemingly large, huge piece of wood. But once upon a time, you were only to get as wide as the tree was. And you had to figure out a way how you were going to slice this, and it had to come out, slice it, and you had to plane it. Hiram hears the words of Shlomo. Yismach Moed. He was very happy. There was a good deal coming along. Granted David a wise son to rule over the people, and he was so wise that he chose me to be his contractor. Not only am I going to do it with cedar wood, I'm also going to do it with cypress wood. It's another very expensive wood. We're going to make rafts. So we're going to chop down logs. We're going to send them down with rafts, and you're going to carry them away. And you provide the food. I'm going to do the actual labor, and you do the logistics. He gave him all of the wood, all of the lumber. Every single year he was giving him this arrangement. Obviously this took a long time. Hashem nosan chokhmah l'shlomo, and Hashem gave him great wisdom. These two rulers made a pact between them. This is the time of peace in the Jewish people. He collects a tax, and this tax was 30,000 people. That means that not only did they tax you with money, they taxed you with labor. It means you had to give labor for the community service, exactly. So that's what it means. He sent them a shift. So there were shifts of 10,000 a month. So you went 1 month, you came home 2 months, and then you went again. So there was a shift of community service where everybody, these 30,000 people, those 10,000, they worked, went home, worked, went home. He had 70,000 carriers, and 80,000 stone choppers. Which, by the way, if you ever thought that the Beis Hamikdash, the stones weren't allowed to be made from steel, that's only once it gets to the actual Beis Hamikdash. But the removal from the site of actually getting the stone was done with steel. And if you go today, just the second Beis Hamikdash period, you could actually go in Yerushalayim, you could see the quarries where they quarried, and you could see actually the spaces of where they have today. They know stones which are by the actual on the Harabayas. They could say, oh, this stone came from this place where they quarried it, and you could see the tools, and they explained to you how they did it. Levad then they had directors, and they tell them they see Avonim Gedolos, Avonim Yekaros, Liyased Avnei Gozes, and they brought all these heavy stones. Vayifslu boinei Shloimo, boinei Chiram, vagiboilem, vayachinu ha'etzem va'avonim livnois haboyes, and they prepared all of these stones and all of the wood to build the Beis Hamikdash. And that's basically this chapter is describing how he set up his cabinet, the great wealth that was there, the system that it took to make it, recognize the people that help you out, and use your wealth to build a house for Hashem.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.